Okay, I am David Krell. I am with the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. It is my pleasure to introduce Dylan Kornhauser and Jacob Kornhauser, authors of Max Gordon. And they're going to tell us about the journey of Max, his comeback. Do either of you have a copy of the book that you can hold up?
Give me 1 second.
Actually, you know what? We'll start over. I have it. You know what?
I was going to actually make my background.
I'm going to stop recording. Hi, I'm David Krell with the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. I'm here with Dylan Kornhauser and Jacob Kornhauser, two brothers who have authored Max Gordon, Life, Loss, and Baseball's Greatest Comeback. It is no doubt movie fodder. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let me ask you just a basic question, whomever wants to field this. What is this story about and how did you learn about it? Because I found it fascinating.
Yeah, so I mean, at its heart, it's about sort of a family's journey from loss and their ability to, I guess, recover from that. On its face, it's more so sort of an against all odds sports story. Max was sort of undersized and for all intents and purposes shouldn't have ended up in Division I baseball, but ended up at one of the best programs in Division I with Oregon State, and then ended up starting there by his senior year. So that's sort of the surface level and at its heart. And then I came across it because I was working as a local television reporter in Medford, Oregon, which sort of covers the area that Max lived in. Ashland, Oregon is actually where I lived when I worked there. And so I kept hearing this story from the Southern Oregon University football coach, Charlie Hall, who was at Ashland High School when all of this was going on. And so he's sort of a very quiet, intense guy, and he doesn't speak hyperbolically very much. And so when he sort of told me about this story and how crazy it was, I knew to take it seriously, and then ended up reaching out to Max, and the rest is history.
The heart of the story is the relationship between two brothers, Max and Nick, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But first, I want to ask you about some other members of the family. I wrote this down. You talk about the mom, and you talk about Nick's mom and Max's mom as having determination, dedication, and influence. And then you write about Grandpa Norman, who should have a book of his own because he really is quite a character. So I wonder if you could talk to me about the influence that both of them had on the two boys.
Yeah, so I think it sort of from Grandpa Norman sort of handed down to Michelle, because she was adopted by Grandpa Norman and his wife, obviously her mother. And so he was sort of a character and always really clung to the idea of family, because he ran away at a young age to kind of pursue his own thing. Right. And that's sort of the story you allude to when he goes to California, kind of establishing his whole life. So that's why he sort of clung to family and really instilled that in her. And then she sort of passed that down to the boys. And I think that's why they were so close knit and why they held family so close. Max
Was the smaller of the two. He might have even been one of the smaller ones in his class among his friends. But as far as injury, as far as getting hurt, he seemed to bounce back at a young age. Injury didn't seem to faze him at all. And you talk about Grandpa Norman, seeing him as the emotional strength, or I'm sorry, the father. His father saw him as the emotional strength. He has a coach, Coach K, who dies, and Grandpa Norman also dies. This is within a month of each other. I wonder if you could talk about Coach K for a little bit. And then what did Max's father see in Max that allowed him to be the emotional backbone of the family?
Yeah, Coach K, Dave Kitchell, he was and still is a legend in Ashland. Again, I worked there and covered athletics in that area for a few years, and his name would still always constantly come up, even, almost a decade later, or I guess more than a decade later. And so he was just sort of an emotional guy who was connected to the community as well. And so he was very intense but fair with the team, and everyone sort of connected to him. And then obviously as he was getting more sick with his cancer, he became, I think, even more of an inspiration to the team, because it just became so clear, you know, how precious those moments were with him during that season. When he got sick enough that he was in hospice, they were able to, in like 2008, get a live stream somehow to his house. So all the effort that went into that, I think, speaks to sort of the impact that he had on everyone. And then in terms of Max's inner strength, I think with everything that ended up happening, he almost felt like he didn't have a choice but to be that strength, because, you know,
Right.
it was only him and Nick in terms of the brothers within that family. So I think he took it upon himself to sort of be that healing force for the family. And obviously that leads to further issues, because he sort of like
Right.
full-heartedly went like blinders on, and that led to later issues. But I think that's what led him to have that sort of mental and emotional strength.
Yeah, and if I can just
Yeah,
piggyback
sure.
off of that, I think that that's actually where you really get at what the dramatic pitch is for this story, is that when you're trying to tell the story of a young guy, especially a young athlete, you know, the first people you're going to talk about are these father figures and
Right.
his family, because as a young person, especially in a small place like Ashland, like Etna before that, like those are the people who you find out who you are through. He's
Right.
establishing his identity through these key figures, and the mental toughness that he has, especially like the grit, you know, that he finds that through his older brother Nick, through his
Right.
coach Kay, and through his grandpa Norman. And so it really is the unlikelihood and the sheer scale of the fact that he loses all three of those figures in such short order
Right.
that really you see him trying to compensate for all of that toughness, all of the support that he had and lost. He's trying to do that all for himself. And so when you ask, you know, why or how is he mentally tough enough to take on that role as the man of the house, as, you know, the core of the family, he's not. He's just a
Right.
young guy, and he's repressing his trauma. He's delaying his grieving process because he doesn't see any other choice but to just put all of that onto himself. And that's what's
Right.
going to lead to sort of the kind of personal collapse that we chronicle through the middle of the story.
Sports obviously plays a huge role, not just baseball. What kind of sports did Max and Nick play when they were younger? And back then, who was the bigger, better athlete? Was it still Nick?
Yeah, still Nick, just because of the age difference, I think. But Max was sort of that scrappy, sort of annoying little brother who would still be able to compete because, you know, he wanted to play with all of Nick's friends. So they'd play football, baseball, pretty much anything they could. They had like trampoline excursions that led to some fights as well.
Right.
So I think it was one of those things where it was a lot of the kids in their neighborhood were either Max's age or Nick's age, or both, sort of families that had, you know, kids in that same area. So
Right.
it seems like the younger group, which included Max, sort of had to be a little tougher if they wanted to play with the older kids.
Now, this is where the story really takes a surprising, horrifying turn. Nick dies in a car accident. This is only a couple of months after Grandpa Norman's death. So the family is still grieving. And then this tragedy happens. Take us through the details of the accident, if you could, and how did it affect Max physically and then emotionally?
Yeah, so Max and Nick actually got skiing tickets up in Bend, which is a few hours away from Ashland. This was supposed to like take their mind off of all the tragedy that had sort of already happened in the last couple of months. It was a Christmas gift from their parents. And so they go up to Bend, they have this skiing trip. And then when they're coming back down, they make a stop about 30 to 45 minutes away from Ashland. Then when they get back on the road, it's very snowy. Max is in the passenger seat, Nick is driving. They try to pass a car as I guess they're going over sort of like an uphill. So the left-hand lane would be sort of obscured.
Right.
So they try to make a pass. By the time they see another car is coming head on, they sort of swerve, but they're in the snow. It's not sort of a pinpoint turn. So they end up spinning and get T-boned. And so Nick was killed at the scene, and then Max from what he remembers, he basically like tries to stumble out of the car. He
Right.
hit his head on the dashboard and then sort of just blacks out. And so he wakes up in the ICU after sort of a long coma. They didn't know what was going to happen with him. His parents thought initially they had lost both of their children. So I think that sort of glimmer of hope that the Max hadn't been killed in the accident is also what sort of led to everything else as well. And so, yeah, he was in a coma, lost a ton of weight, and just was very, very weak, upper respiratory issues and all that sort of stuff. So it sort of set the stage for a long recovery.
My name is David Krell. I'm talking to Dylan and Jacob Kornhauser, authors of Max Gordon, Life, Loss, and Baseball's Greatest Comeback. Dylan, let me ask you an overall writer's question. Was this easier to write, do you think, because you were brothers, because you're able to tap into that bonding that Max and Nick had? There's a shorthand among siblings, especially brothers. So I'm wondering if you think that was maybe easier for you than it might have been for another duo.
Yeah, definitely. I think at the conceptual level, we were starting from a place that we understood, from a core relationship that we understood. And also we grew up playing any sport that we could get our hands on and competing any way we could. And so I think that it really was actually a useful exercise for us to kind of put all of that competition growing up in perspective, and sort of realize we were always trying to be better than each other. We were always trying to be right about everything.
Right.
But if we lost this relationship that we have, all of a sudden, like, there would be a huge thing missing from our lives. And I'm not sure, like, when we started writing this, I was, I think, 20.
Wow.
And so I don't know if we had really put that into words or had that explicitly understood between us before we did this project together. So that was really valuable for the two of us as brothers. And I think maybe it made it a little more difficult at times because it forced me to confront some of those things. Like if we were writing a story about something that I didn't relate to personally, I could have removed myself more from it. But there were some moments where I felt what I hope the people reading the book will feel, which is that I was right there with Max, sort of actually experiencing some of the loss and some of the grief with him. So it was very interesting to write this story with my older brother.
Jacob?
Yeah, I mostly, sort of echo his sentiments. It was an interesting exercise in sort of, like you said, eliminating that communication gap. We sort of know how each other communicates in terms of if we were trying to like iron out thematic elements of the book and all that sort of thing. So from like the writing perspective, that really helped. And then obviously from the point of view of being able to both relate to Nick and Max's story and hopefully like draw on our own experiences to like bring that out in the writing. It was super special to have that sort of connection to the story.
What I like the most about the book is the lack of sentimentality. You do not sugarcoat this. You do not make it a Disney movie. You did an outstanding amount of research between the interviews and just the factual the factual parts of the games that you chronicle, which we'll talk about. So kudos for the research, but the writing style is such that I really felt like you were telling me the story if we were sitting in a diner, just having a burger and fries, and conversational writing is so hard to get to. So I applaud you both. There's a figure in this story I'd like you to talk about. Pat Casey is a crucial figure. How does he make it into this story, and how does he factor into Max's comeback?
Yeah, so Pat Casey, I guess for people who aren't familiar as much with college baseball, he's sort of like the Nick Saban, I guess you could say, of college baseball. Very successful, has won multiple national championships, and sort of just had a meteoric rise after he arrived at Oregon State. So he was the head baseball coach at Oregon State during this time. He had already won a couple national titles by the time that Max was sort of put in touch with him. So Max is trying to make a comeback after this sort of, emotional hurdles that he had to jump over, that we sort of alluded to earlier. So he gets from Sam Gaviglio, his former high school teammate who was at Oregon State. He gets Pat Casey's number. He just calls him up, doesn't expect to get an answer, but he does get an answer, sort of arranges for this meeting with Pat Casey to talk about, sort of the future and if he would have any chance of trying to play at Oregon State, which seemed super far-fetched at the time, even for him and for Pat Casey. But they do eventually end up meeting, and Pat Casey just sort of like falls in love with Max eventually, because he's exactly the type of player that sort of every coach dreams about having, as far as like a hard worker and an inspiration to the rest of the team.
So let's talk about the actual comeback. What kind of physical, mental, and emotional states were Max in? Number one, family and friends and coaches didn't appear to think it was even realistic that he'd play any sport. So take us through that, and please tell us who Max's maniacs are.
Yeah, so he initially played junior college baseball, and even, coming back so early for his senior high school baseball season was crazy. Then going on and playing JUCO was crazy. He sort of has this emotional wall that he hits. And so then by the time he's going to Oregon State, he's sort of healed physically. But again, he's just this small player who's not quite as fast, not quite as big as you would see at a program like this. But he's still dealing, obviously, with a lot of these emotional demons that he's sort of gotten over enough to be able to focus enough to play baseball and sort of once again put the blinders on and play. But he's not playing right away at Oregon State. He's getting in as a defensive replacement here and there, pinch hit at bat, pinch running. But eventually he's making so many crazy diving plays in the outfield that some of the fans start to take notice, and this sort of fan section called Max's Maniacs pops up. They make t-shirts and everything, and they're sort of super fans of Max Gordon, who even at this time when they were established, he wasn't playing very much at all. So it was kind of cool to see that, and then to see their sort of dedication to him pay off by the end when he is playing a lot and playing sort of a more major role with Oregon State.
Was the family willing or reluctant at first to chronicle this story?
Yeah, so I think Max was pretty into doing the story. He wasn't that reluctant, but his parents were very reluctant to do the story. He sort of I kind of made it clear that like I would have to talk to them to do the story justice. I don't think we could have written this story, without their direct perspective.
Right.
And so as Max and I were doing interviews, it was unclear if that was going to happen. And I was obviously hoping that it would happen. But he eventually, I think once he got comfortable doing the interviews, he sort of told them, or I guess reflected to them, that this was sort of a serious project that was worth doing. So I ended up spending, several hours in their living room. We had lunch together doing the interview with both of them. It was super emotional, but I was very, very thankful that they really, you mentioned the sugarcoating. They didn't sugarcoat anything. I felt like I was getting sort of the direct, real, raw emotional story from them. So I was super thankful for that.
Dylan, all books start with research. And as I said before, you both did an outstanding amount. What surprised you the most in this story when you set out on this journey?
It's appropriate that we were just talking about Stan and Michelle and their participation in this, because I think from my side, coming from Jacob being the sports writer who gathered this story and compiled most of the source material research for it, when I was pouring through all of those manuscripts, my big question when I was trying to sort of novelize this story was, who are the narrators? Because to me, when I was reading through Max's material, we have a protagonist who he has been through so much, and his firsthand experience is not necessarily objective. And so I actually found Stan and Michelle to be the ones telling me what happened. They were the people who, as I was going through the story myself, they were the ones I could rely on to be caring with the story and to be gentle with it, but also to be the ones who I could trust to be not sugarcoating things,
Right.
to not let their biases into their accounts, and I think like at its heart, this story is being told by Stan and Michelle. It's a story about their son and what he had to go through to
Right.
play his role in the healing of the family. Because while on its face, this is a baseball story, it really is an accessible story to anyone who has been a part of a household that has experienced such a profound loss.
Right.
How you figure out how to go from square one to there. That was the project for me, was getting into all of this information, all of these accounts, and finding what's the emotional heart of this story. And that to me was the relationship between Max and his parents.
Right. It's also a story about small towns and the grit that it takes. And the towns you alluded to are smaller than most. It's not like a typical suburb of 15, 20,000. It's even smaller. And I just took that as the heartland of America. I know we think of the heartland as the Midwest, but to me, it's any small town in America. And I really, really enjoyed it. I as a reader, I saw this as you guys being the narrators, almost like if you remember the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer special, Burl Ives as the snowman comes at different points and tells you the story. So I, as a reader, I saw this from all different perspectives. I saw it from the coach's perspective. I saw it from the grandpa's perspective. I saw it from Max and Nick's perspective. I saw it from Stan and Michelle's perspective. I saw it from Max's Maniac's perspective. But you did a great job in just coalescing that and not deviating towards any particular bias, as you said. Just tell us the story. Let's lay it out. The emotion is there. We don't have to build it up. We don't have to embellish it. It's a heart-wrenching thing. I mean, that scene in the house where Michelle thinks they're both dead is just, I felt like I was actually in the room. I felt like I was actually in the living room with them when you're describing her horror. And then she realizes, well, it's just one is dead, but the other is really severely injured. And just the way you chart the comeback in a very slow, deliberate manner. You take your time. And I know there's a temptation in stories like this to let's just get to the comeback. Let's just, injuries, let's summarize that in 4 pages, and the stress, will summarize that in 4 pages. And then let's just get to the comeback games. You didn't do that. So I'm really thankful as a reader to have that kind of pacing. Jacob, what surprised you the most in the research?
I think just some of the crazy stories, honestly, that because statistical stuff you have to sort of paint the picture of some of these games. But I think the non-game stories that I ended up hearing surprised me the most. For example, Pat Casey just offhand mentioned in one of our interviews a time when Max pulled a duck head out of the back of his baseball pants that he was wearing in a game. So then I had to ask Max about that and some other of his teammates to kind of paint the picture of what this duck beheading story was. So it was just some of the ridiculous stories like that came out that sort of started as a kernel or an offhand comment by someone, and then me sort of, putting the puzzle together of what the heck they're talking about, because I had to interview a bunch of other people to sort of piece together what was going on. And so I think that led to some memorable scenes in the book.
My name is David. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just
give you another plug.
He reminded me of my favorite story, which Jacob, you can give a little more of the detail on it. My favorite non-game Max story from the book. I think it's while he's playing JUCO, and it's when he has to break in to get the equipment to play BP. If you wanted to tell that one quick, I think that's like a perfect encapsulation of Max's attitude and what got him to where he ended up getting.
Yeah, I think it was a perfect encapsulation of his wholehearted dedication to playing baseball and doing it all the time, because he would essentially at his junior college climb over this fence on this elevated area, try to work his way into this shed where all of the baseball equipment was, that I guess was locked before he started doing this. Then the baseball coach, who would also coach some type of PE-esque class, would see him doing this every day. And so eventually they ended up putting a different lock on the door, but he would have this just comical pulling 2 buckets of balls, putting
Right.
it on the fence, throwing it off the dugout, and then jumping down, and then just taking like BP by himself. Yeah,
Like Tom
just
Cruise dropping down in Mission Impossible just to get a bucket of balls.
My name is David Krell. I'm here with Dylan and Jacob Kornhauser, authors of Max Gordon, Life, Loss, and Baseball's Greatest Comeback. So we talked about the story. I'd like to focus a little bit on the journey to publication. How did you approach that? And was there a reluctance at first to work together, because authors are solitary creatures? And it's very difficult to join forces because styles may be different, organization may be different, researching approaches may be different. Take us through that, and then how did you decide which publishers to target?
Yeah, so I think as we've sort of talked about, our writing process was pretty straightforward because it was sort of my journalism experience of chronicling the story in like kind of a straightforward manner, and then Dylan more of sort of the prose, novelizing, like he said, the story to kind of smooth out some thematic elements and all that sort of stuff, and really paint some great scenes better. So that worked fine because it wasn't like we were writing, I was writing this chapter as he was writing another chapter. So that worked well. But then in terms of going toward publication, we had reached out to, like you said, sort of this is a movie quality sort of thing, sort of like IP type houses. We weren't really sure what we were going to do with this at first. McFarland ended up being the clear choice by the time we had a few like more concrete options. Just Gary
Right.
Mitchum, who was
Yeah, I
our
know
sort of
Gary.
acquisition editor. He obviously has a bunch of other sports titles as well. So eventually we felt comfortable going with him and with McFarland, and we were super happy about it.
No, McFarland's great. I've worked with them a few times, so I was delighted to see it's a McFarland property. If you're going to take this to Hollywood, which I hope that you do, or maybe you already have, or have received offers, who would you cast in these roles? Who would you cast as Max and Nick?
Yeah, we were talking about this beforehand. It's hard because I was actually thinking, if you were going to really Hollywood this story, what you would have to do is expand the characters of Stan and Michelle. I think they would be the big ticket actors in this potentially, because Max and Nick are going to be young guys. Neither of us are keeping track of the Nickelodeon and Disney Channel actors who are coming up now. But I was thinking like a classic Tom Hanks, like a sturdy father figure role would really, I think, be the thing that might make this a serviceable IP for cinema.
Yeah, and I was almost thinking for Max and Nick to stay with sort of the like authenticity. It would have to be sort of lesser known, up and coming actors that fit that mold. Because I kept thinking of like well-known actors around that age, and just none of them seemed to fit when I was thinking about this. So I think it would have to be, two sort of up and coming actors that would lend more authenticity, that maybe they're not as well known and people aren't thinking of them as all these other things that they've been in. Of course, there needs to be a Tom Hanks type person to make it marketable, but I think perhaps for them, it would be maybe up and coming actors.
Well, it's an inspirational story, and there are certainly a lot of these in the sports realm. But I highly recommend people watching or listening to go and pick it up. My last question to the both of you is, when you were going on this journey of researching, and Jacob, you reach out to Dylan, hey, I'd like you to work with me on this, and you both agreed to do it. What was the writing process like in terms of surprises? I asked you about research, but when you're writing it, what was the biggest surprise or lesson that you learned during the writing process?
I can jump on this one if you want, Jacob. So I think it's important maybe to note, and to also put in another little plug for you here, Jay. I had edited his previous book, Jacob's first title, Cup of Coffee Club, which published with Ronan Atkinson a couple of years ago. And that one, he had anthologized these stories, and they were much more journalistic in nature. in a final form. They didn't need to be, each one was kind of more of a short story, and it actually did read kind of like an ESPN special report story. And so that was fine. I did basic proofreading and story editing for him. And so the original agreement was that I would do the same thing for this one. He kind of had the idea to write this as kind of a sports report story. And when I read it, I was like, Jacob, this has an actual arc. This has heart, that this could really be a story if we wanted to flesh this out and really kind of find the literary quality in it, you know? And so I basically told him at the time, I don't think that I want to just edit this. I think I want to actually get my hands dirty and create the story with you. And so at that time, I was an aspiring writer. I hadn't published anything on my own. And so I think the biggest surprise for me was honestly when he agreed to let me write it with him. And when we started out and he would send me something and tell me to have a copy ready for him by a certain time, I would send him some sentences, I would send him a chapter. And when he would actually read through it all and have his comments and accept it all and say, yeah, this is ready, I like this, that was, to me, look at this guy, my big brother, sure, but a published author and a sports writer by his own right, very accomplished, an Emmy winner in production. And so he approved my work to go into his product, something his name was going to be on. And that, to me, that was the thing where I was like, wow, I didn't realize what that was going to do for me as a writer. I didn't realize what that sort of validation would do for me moving forward. So that was really special for me.
Jacob, what did you learn on the writing journey?
Yeah, I didn't realize how much, more work that it needed after sort of the initial draft. Like he said, I'm more of sort of a straightforward journalistic like reporting. And certainly from collaborating with Dylan, I've picked up pieces of, writing in better prose for this type of project. But I think just how much like massaging the core story needed in order to like communicate it in a way that it would connect with people and that they would really follow sort of like through lines throughout the book. So that was super rewarding, so that for whatever next project, I take on or we take on, I think starting in that place before sort of the core of the story is written will be really useful to sort of be able to tell other stories in the same way.
Well, I thank you both for your time. I wish you the best of luck. The name of the book is Max Gordon, Life, Loss, and Baseball's Greatest Comeback, Jacob Kornhauser and Dylan Kornhauser. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
David, thanks so much. Have a great day.
You too.